So before you get started today, we need to talk about number 6 on yesterday's assignment. So here I have question number 6. The bottom of this one, the denominator in this one didn't really cause any problems, but the numerator did. So we're going to focus just on the numerator for just a minute. So if you're looking just at this numerator, you know that in order to simplify this fraction, you have to see if it will factor first. So when we factor the numerator, a lot of you yesterday tried to factor it the way we've learned how to factor before, which is build a multiply add chart. You want two numbers that multiply to a times c, so -1 times -63, positive 63, and then add to b, 16. Okay, well, you know that, 9 and 7 will multiply to positive 63 and add to 16. So a lot of you then came over here and said, okay, well, so we have x plus 9 and x plus 7. But then you remembered that if a is not 1, you have to divide by it. So then you came by and you divided by -1. And then you got x minus 9, x minus 7, which looks great, but it's not right. And here's why it's not right. When x is a negative, when your leading coefficient, when a, your first number, the number with x squared is a negative, you cannot use this method. You can, but you have to take out the negative first. Because if you jump straight through the multiply add chart, you end up with this answer. Well, if these are truly the factors, then if I multiplied it back out, I would end up with this again. So let's check it. X times x, x squared. X times -7 is -7x. -9 times x, -9x. And -9 times -7 is positive 63. So I have x squared minus 16x plus 63. And that is not the same as what I started with because my x squared is still a positive value. So anytime you see an a value that is a negative number, you cannot go to this first. You have to take the negative number out first. And I didn't do a very good job of making that a big deal when we first learned how to factor. So here's what we've got. A is -1. Step 1. We're going to take the -1 out, and we're going to figure out what's left over. So -1x squared divided by -1 is positive x squared. 16 divided by -1 is -16x. -63 divided by -1 is positive 63. Okay, now I'm going to use my multiply add chart to factor this, the leftovers. So I need two numbers that will multiply to a positive 63, but I need them to add to -16. So -9 and -7 will do both of those things. So now I have a -1, an x minus 9, and an x minus 7. And that works because if I checked it, if I multiplied this back out, I'd get x squared minus 16x plus 63. But then when I multiply it by the -1, now we have true factors. So our factors are -1, x minus 9, and x minus 7. Okay, now if we finish this problem, let's come to the bottom. The bottom, we need two numbers that multiply to -35 and add to -2. So -7 and positive 5 will do that. So on the bottom, I have x minus 7 and x plus 5. Okay, so now to continue to simplify, my like factors, x minus 7, cancel. So I have -1 times x minus 9 in the numerator, and I have x plus 5 in the denominator. And you can leave it like that, or you can distribute the -1 back out and say you have -1x plus 9 over x plus 5. So either of those are acceptable simplified answers of your fraction. Okay, so what we learned is, first, you have to divide the negative number. So if it starts with a negative, you have to take a negative out first. That's your first factor. Then you can find the others, okay? Now let's talk about zeros for a second because this kind of trips some of you up. When you want to know, or not zeros, when we talk about where it's undefined, you have a fraction, right? Ultimately, that's what we have. And we've done a lot of factoring within it, but we have a fraction. And so you could assume in your simplified answer that any number, x stands for any number in the world, right? You could pick any number for x and plug that in and see what you would get. We've done that. But there's a rule in math that says the denominator of your fraction cannot be 0. So I have an expression here with x's, which means I could pick any number I wanted to plug in for it. But because it's a fraction, there's a couple numbers that x cannot stand for. So to figure out what x cannot be, we have to take the denominator and say that we cannot have this equal 0. So in my expression that has random variable x, and x stands for any number you want it to, there has to be some rules to that because I have a fraction. So because I have a fraction, I have to say, okay, x can be any number you want, except it cannot be anything that would make the bottom 0 because that's not mathematically possible. So we're just finding the x values that wouldn't work. So the x values that don't work here, we have, I cannot solve this denominator for 0 because it has an x squared. So we're going to factor it first, which we already did. So x minus 7, x plus 5. We cannot have it equal to 0. So x minus 7 cannot equal 0, which means that x cannot be equal to positive 7. And x plus 5 cannot equal 0, which means x cannot equal negative 5. So in my random expression that I have here that I just simplified, we just have x's, and x's are going to stand for any number you ever want them to stand for. That's what it means. But because we have a fraction, we have to be a little bit more specific and say, okay, I know that in this simplified answer, I've left you with a random variable x, but I need you to know that that x cannot be 7 or negative 5. That's really all you're saying. So I hope that clears some things up. The other thing that was kind of weird is people felt real weird about question number 2. Question number 2 is just a fraction that can be simplified. You don't have to factor it first. So in the notes I gave you yesterday, I taught you if you have something that can be factored, you have to factor it before you can simplify. But if you have a fraction like this, well, you've been simplifying fractions like that for a long time. 70 over 100 is really 7/10, and x squared over x is really just 1x left over. Then when you want to know what numbers x can't stand for, because we have a fraction, so we need to be specific, and then you just took the denominator, say it can't equal 0. There's no factoring that needs to be done because there's just an x, so you can just solve. So divide by 100, x still can't equal 0. So that's how I came up with all that. And I think yesterday the notes focused so much on factoring that you don't forget about the things you already know. You already know how to do that. Number 4, people were trying to take, so you have to factor the top, right? You factor the numerator. The denominator doesn't have to be factored, which means that when you take that denominator and say it can't equal 0, you don't factor it. You just straight up solve for x. And I know that if I subtract 1 from both sides, I have x can't equal negative 1. So I think yesterday the notes focused so much on the factoring piece that you kind of forgot those solving skills that you already have, okay? So sometimes you have to factor, sometimes you can't, sometimes you can. So anyway, hopefully that clears some things up. But the main point of this video is if you have an a value or a leading coefficient or the number in front of x squared, if it's a negative, you have to divide by the negative 1 first, okay? All right, that's it.